Hello, everyone, and welcome to the championship round of Students for Liberty's very first debate competition. My name is Yusuf Mahmood. I'm a programs associate with Students for Liberty in North America, and I will be the moderator of today's debate. Today, we're lucky not only to have two incredible debaters from Students for Liberty's coordinator program, but we're also very fortunate to be joined by three of the most prominent scholars in the libertarian movement today. The resolution of today's debate is, on balance, violent revolution is a just response to political oppression. Before today, debaters were expected to prepare cases on both sides of this resolution. Neither debater will know which side they're debating until coin flip just moments before the debate. Since this is a Lincoln-Douglas style debate, our debaters will organize their speeches as follows. The affirmative will deliver their case for 6 minutes. Then the negative will cross-examine them for 3 minutes. Afterwards, the negative will deliver their own case and rebuttals for 7 minutes. Then the affirmative will cross-examine the negative. After this cross-examination, the affirmative will deliver their rebuttal speech for 4 minutes. The negative will deliver their rebuttal and summary speech for 6 minutes. And finally, the affirmative will end the round with a 3-minute summary speech. Throughout the debate, both participants will have 3 minutes to use for prep time, however and whenever they would like. And again, today I will be moderating this debate. Now I would like to introduce both our judges and our debaters. Randy E. Barnett is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Legal Theory at the Georgetown University Law Center, where he teaches constitutional law and contracts and is director of the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. A recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship in Constitutional Studies, Professor Barnett has been a visiting professor at Penn, Northwestern, and Harvard Law School. Professor Barnett's publications include 12 books, more than 100 articles and reviews, as well as numerous op-eds. He is an impressive legal thinker. He has argued in front of the Supreme Court, and he is arguably easily one of the most influential libertarians in all of legal academia. I would argue perhaps the most influential libertarian in legal academia today. Specifically, I think he'll be excellent for this debate given his appreciation and knowledge of Lysander Spooner, a known advocate of slave rebellions and someone who is clearly skeptical of established regimes. Welcome, Randy Barnett.
Great to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Jason Brennan is the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Chair and Associate Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown. He specializes in political philosophy and applied ethics. He's the author of Against Democracy, Markets Without Limits, In Defense of Openness, and many, many other books. He is easily one of my favorite libertarian philosophers today, and I think he would be a very interesting judge for this resolution, given his recent book, When All Else Fails, The Ethics of Resistance to State Injustice, in which he argues that citizens have the right to resist unjust government. Welcome, Jason Brennan.
Thanks.
And finally, our third judge is Tom Palmer. Tom G. Palmer is the George M. Yeager Chair for Advancing Liberty and Executive Vice President for International Programs at the Atlas Network. He is responsible for operating programs in 14 languages and managing programs for a worldwide network of think tanks. He is also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and director of Cato University. Before joining Cato, he was an H.B. Earhart Fellow at Hertford College, Oxford University, and a vice president of the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. In addition to being a friend, I consider Dr. Palmer to be a great mentor of mine, and I think given his habit of smuggling banned books into authoritarian countries, he too will have an interesting perspective on this topic. Welcome, Dr. Palmer. You're muted.
It's an honor.
Thank you. Now I would like to introduce our two debaters, the people who you all came to watch and support. This tournament started out with 15 debaters, and after several rigorous and entertaining rounds, our contestants have fought their way to the final round. Christian Watson is a nationally published political commentator and host of the Pensive Politics podcast. His work has been featured in USA Today, TheFederalist.com, The Advocate magazine, among others. He has featured guests like Nobel Peace Prize nominee Joshua Wong and Libertarian presidential nominee Joe Jorgensen. Please welcome Christian Watson.
Thank you.
And finally, we have his opponent, Isadore Johnson, who is a rising junior who is majoring in economics and political science at the University of Connecticut. In his spare time, Isadore is a regional coordinator for Students for Liberty, works on the executive board of the student radio station, plays ping pong, and plays lots of Dungeons and Dragons. He He recently built his own computer and has been putting off playing with it until the tournament is over. And I can say his rig is very impressive. Now, before we do our coin flip, we're going to announce a poll. We'd like to ask the audience both before and after the debate which side they agree with. After the debate, we'll ask the same question again and share the results. But ultimately, the winner of this debate will be determined by a simple majority vote among the three judges. I guess you could say we're against democracy. So let's put on this poll. We'll just give it another moment for anyone who just came to this webinar. We are putting up a poll asking people which perspective they agree with. All right, I think quorum has been met. Now, without further ado, I would like us to begin with our coin flip. So, Isadore, will you choose heads or tails?
I'll choose heads.
Okay, and for the record, we have a fair die. It is a Lincoln, or fair coin rather, it's a Lincoln penny from 2018. And the result is heads.
Okay, I guess I'm gonna go negative then.
You're gonna go with negative. Okay, so Isadore will be arguing the negative side. That means that Christian Watson will be arguing the affirmative. So Christian, you have 6 minutes for your opening affirmative speech, unless you'd like to take any prep time right now.
Well, before I begin, I would like to thank everyone, the panelists, the judges, you, Isadore, for doing this in my opinion, important event. I think that it is crucial to the development of a free society and a healthy mind to engage in critical discourse around issues that may or may not be engaged in critical ways these days. So I want to thank you guys. So I'll begin now. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Absolve you to yourself, and you shall have the suffrage of the world. Ralph Waldo Emerson. It is upon this divine Emersonian adage that I unequivocally affirm the resolution that violent revolution is a just response to political oppression. My value for this debate is ultimately justice, which is the equitable adherence to individual rights and their preservation. In this instance, whenever justice or justice is used in this case, it shall refer to the dispensation of this principle by governmental bodies. Oppression refers to any forceful or coercive action by which individuals are substantially inhibited in the exercise of their individual rights. My criterion is the principle of natural rights as the animating force of existence. This deontological method provides a consistent, objective, and holistic methodology by which to weigh oppression and justice by. Additionally, the principle of natural rights is the most coherent criterion for this topic. As philosopher Lysander Spooner stated, if there be in nature such a principle as justice, such a principle as honesty, such principles as we describe by the words mine and thine, such principles as men's natural rights of person and property, then we have an immutable and universal law. Of course, among the individualist crop of philosophers, to aggress the individual is to infringe upon life, which is clear and material. Thus, in this theory, individuals have clear grounds by which to seek recourse for oppression while also preserving their existence. Observation 1, resolutional analysis. The resolution demands of us as inquisitors to provide a determination about the methodology behind political action. To do this, we have to evaluate how justice and rights exist in the Platonic realm of the forms and how well they perform here on earth in reference to objective criteria. Principles such as justice and rights are consistently aspired to and should be chased in a manner that approaches the best iteration of those ideas. Thus, both sides must argue about the relation between natural rights and justice in an abstract sense as they are compared to oppression in the material world. Contention 1, force protects rights. Force as a matter of principle secure rights. Laws, for example, which Frederick Bastiat mentioned definitionally, protect rights when in their proper legitimate functions are secured by force. Even outside of institutional instances, force has been used to preserve liberty and all of its contents. When Harriet Tubman freed several crops of captured people, she wielded a revolver to ward off slave captures and indifference among the freedmen. When a government becomes oppressive with force, historically, force has been used to fight tyranny. This evidence has a few implications. One, force can be an effective deterrent to oppression, and two, force can be used to negate anti liberty force and rights protections. Contention 2, oppression compels force and or self-defense. Subpoint A, the core of human existence is survival, as evidenced by civilizations, houses, and other amenities which facilitate that activity. Therefore, any violation of rights, which is also incidentally a violation of survival, compels the individual to secure their existences in some forceful manner. Subpoint B, historically, certain marginalized groups have propagated their existence primarily through force. The Kurds, for example, have organized militias to protect themselves against ISIS, against Erdogan in Turkey, against all other aggressive governments, or against people that simply want to infringe upon their life. The Zapatistas in Mexico have an entire region which they lay claim to that they used force to ward off cartels, ward off people who might want to, the Mexican government who might want to take it away from them, and so on and so forth. And there are numerous other examples of people who are legitimately fighting against political oppression who have used force. I think the American Revolution is probably one of the most prescient examples of that, which is manifested in a free society, so to speak. Contention 3, when political participation is silent, peaceful resistance cannot occur. Subpoint A, when the state approaches passive citizens with overwhelming force, peaceful and non-voluntary modes of action are muffled. It destroys the possibility for nonviolent resistance for the following reasons. Number 1, A, their voices are silenced. B, their actions are restricted by the parameter of the state. And C, all of these things ultimately restrict their political participation in Republican or Democratic forms of government. Subpoint B, in the event that the oppression occurs outside the context of a republic, passive resistance to secure rights is not an option in the first place. The Uyghurs, an example, or in a non-free state and are incapable of passive resistance. According to the AP News, China's Politburo has engaged in eugenics-type operations to control and cut the rate of the Uyghur population in half. Experts are calling it demographic genocide. The report mentions that the state regularly subjects minority women to pregnancy tests, forced devices in their body, sterilization, and even abortion on hundreds of thousands of people. The interviews and data have shown. This is simply one example of a variety of instances of oppression that necessitate force as a response to secure natural rights. Subpoint C. Oppression is done arbitrarily. This is a more principled philosophical point, which commands us to correct it concretely, as per the deontological principle. If you cannot do this passively, force is the only option, and given the power imbalance between the state and the people, force is pretty much the only option to correct and defend against violations of natural rights. For all of these reasons, Judge, I urge you to vote in the affirmation of this resolution, and I stand ready for cross-examination.
Okay, can I get 30 seconds before I start?
Yes, you may. Your 30 seconds is up.
You ready, Christian?
Whenever you are, my friend.
Could you quickly go over your definitions again?
Sure, definitions for what exactly?
You define justice and
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So justice is essentially the equitable adherence to individual rights amongst governmental institutions. Particularly in this instance, governmental institutions were dealing with repression and political oppression, particularly. Yeah.
So, under this definition, would city-goers be oppressed?
City-goers?
Yeah, like in the United States, they're taxed more than their rural counterparts. Would you agree that something like this would be tantamount to oppression?
Yeah, I think there are different degrees of political oppression, and I set the context for that with the examples I mentioned in my case, whether it be the Uyghurs, whether it be the Zapatistas in Mexico, whether it be the Kurds, and so there are different degrees of political oppression. But my definition refers to any coercive action in which individuals are substantially inhibited in the exercise of their individual rights. And whether taxation substantially inhibits someone, I think, is an open question. It certainly inhibits on some level, but substantially is the qualifier I use. So you would have to prove that is a substantial inhibition, and that again would differ on the basis of circumstance.
Yeah. So my next question is, when you're referring to oppression, you defined it as substantial. Do you have any way of determining this?
Yes. Yeah. So if you're not able to exercise your individual rights, you're essentially oppressed. If you are in chains, if you are maimed, if you are incapacitated by some sort of unjust action, yeah, that's pretty substantial in my opinion.
So my next question is, you mentioned primarily grounding this on deontological grounds.
Yes.
What is that?
What's that? What you said?
You mentioned that you're primarily grounding this debate on deontological grounds.
Yes.
Why are you so?
Because consequentially, oppression, so when you have a consequential basis for something, the value is dependent on the circumstance. Deontologically, you have a more concrete ground, a more stable universal foundation for something, which is why I'm doing that. It's more consistent. I think it's a little bit more objective than just saying consequentially, this might be bad, because consequences are based on, well, you know, circumstances, and circumstances are as fickle as the water is. Principles, universal principles, are based on solid ground, and that gives you a much more universal sense in which to operate with.
Okay, so just real quick, could you repeat your third argument's tagline? I just want to make sure I don't misstate and or misrepresent any of your arguments.
Yeah, my third argument is simple. When political participation is silent, peaceful resistance cannot occur. When it's silent, so to speak.
Okay, great, wonderful. So my last question is, what is just revolutionary violence?
What is just revolutionary violence is any violence that emerges from a point of genuine oppression as defined by the resolution to defend one's natural rights. So again, it has to be predicated upon the basis of defending natural rights. Yeah.
Excellent, cool, thank you. And I guess, could I take another 30 seconds or so before starting my speech?
Yes, you may. That is 30 seconds.
Excellent. Pull this bad boy up.
So you have 7 minutes.
Yeah.
But feel free to make an opening.
Yeah, great. That would be nice. I want to thank everyone who has come out to watch today. In particular, I want to thank my mother for being very supportive to me, my former high school debate coach, who taught me what it's like to be a man a little bit more, my friends, my girlfriend, my esteemed opponent, Christian Watson, and the judges for their time today, as well as Yusuf Terminator Mahmood for organizing this tournament. I'm deeply appreciative of everyone here today. And yeah, thank you all. With this in mind, I guess I'll start the speech and explain to you why I disagree. Good afternoon. Since I agree with Martin Luther King that violence is not the answer, I hope to convince you to disagree with the topic at hand. I have 3 big ideas today to convince you why the concept of violent revolution is not one that is just. Before I start, though, I want to point out that I believe that justice is interpretive and there are multiple conceptions of justice, and as such, limiting this debate to one specific interpretation of injustice, I think, is limiting. I do think that there is importance in viewing deontological justice importantly, but we also need to consider utilitarian considerations, virtue ethics, etc. With this in mind, let's move on to my case. My first argument is that what is political oppression to some is freedom to others. One example that speaks to marginalization is in the South during the Civil War. For all practical purposes, despite not even putting Lincoln on the ballot, the South had no strong influence on national politics. Cliven Bundy seized federal ranching land and held up a wildlife preserve, and he did this because he truly believed he was being oppressed by the current grazing regulations. Another example is the rise of happy holidays. Many Christian families feel excluded from traditions and unable to express their unabashed conservative Christianness in public. Australia bans firearm ownership from their country, despite tarantulas. Things we might see as trivial or even terrible may be fundamental to other groups. Understanding this means that accepting that many revolutionary efforts may be aimed at supporting things we fundamentally see as unjust, such as slavery, Karens, and Cliven Bundying. To make this more specific, political philosopher John Simmons expands that there are two problems with the view that the consent of the oppressed is either necessary or sufficient for rightful authority to initiate revolutionary war. First, in virtually every real-world situation, consent will not be unanimous. So two questions immediately present themselves, and a plausible answer to either is far from obvious. One, if consent is necessary for rightful authority, how can anyone have rightful authority over those who do not consent? And two, if consent of some is sufficient for rightful authority over all, how many must consent? Is this a bare majority, a supermajority, etc.? If the point of consent is that without those who initiate revolutionary war are arbitrarily putting those who do not consent at risk, then the fact that some have consented cannot make the imposition of risks on those who did not consent any less arbitrary. Second, in the very circumstances when the just cause for revolution is the most compelling, namely where the regime exercises thoroughgoing domination and refuses to reform, it'll be difficult, if not impossible, to obtain valid consent, either because the regime will not allow any plausible process of gaining consent, or because people will be afraid to affirm their consent out of fear of retaliation by the regime, or because the regime's oppression will have distorted their consciousness and preferences to such an extent that they are incapable of giving valid consent. The implications of this are huge. There's no reason to believe that a revolutionary war necessarily will lead to a more just society or will follow from the needs of the oppressed. Violent revolution does nothing to specifically mirror the preferences and values of the oppressed groups, so there's no reason for you to believe that it'll necessarily lead to justice. In fact, it may be that a group of elites is simply subverted and replaced by another group of elites. This leads me on to my second argument, which is violent revolution, even when it does work, is not necessarily worthwhile. And I've got a couple of reasons for why this is the case. One, people don't put down their guns when they get into power. Two, innocent civilians are almost always brutally murdered. Three, guerrilla groups often use things like sexual coercion and rape aiming at innocent children or civilians. Ultimately, violent means lead to violent ends. In the modern era, violent revolution oftentimes leads to tyrannical rule. Here's why. A post-revolutionary state is a political world without form and void. The norms binding previous regimes are no longer present in a post-revolutionary conflict. Also, distaste for a previous ruler doesn't necessitate appreciation for a new one. This causes leaders to become desperate because they have little support, and rulers end up discovering their own self-interest, which ultimately leads to the road to serfdom. In short, violent means lead to violent ends. In order to maintain compliance, as Fidel Castro did, was to throw all his enemies in prison when people disagreed with him to maintain law and order. My final argument is that violent revolution is not justified on pragmatic grounds. A surveillance state with tanks, guns, and chemical weapons is capable of threatening dissidents without risking security. Revolutionary violence allows illegitimate leaders to harness and consolidate more power. And the amount of violence within modern warfare can eliminate entire oppressed populations. In this way, rebels cannot meet their masters on common footing. So I want to lay out two just choices as alternatives. Number one, there's nonviolent revolution and protest. And the reason why is because A, it's 3 times less likely to encounter mass killings. B, nonviolent change increases the power and popularity of movements. C, it maintains the moral high ground of not giving up or giving into violence. D, soldiers shoot back and there's a there's less of a moral dilemma when you aren't directly being attacked. E, it would give grounds to argue for stopping chaos and maintaining peace, as Omar Wassau describes. And the right to exit fundamentally offers a safety valve that is oftentimes, if not almost always, better. With this in mind, I want to move on to my opponent's case. So my opponent's case pretty much starts by talking about how force protects life. And he talks about substantial oppression. But the problem that I see fundamentally with his claim is, how does he determine which oppression is more important? There's no way of determining which things are ultimately going to be deciding. And if the solution is revolutionary war every time substantial oppression occurs, then we'll have nonstop violence. For a second argument about how oppression compels defense, this doesn't imply revolution. And 3, the political resistance is impossible. I'm about to give a bunch of examples next speech. Thank you, and I end my speech.
So we will now move on to the affirmative cross-examination of the negative, unless you'd like to take prep time.
Oh, no, I'm fine. Thank you. So, Isadore, let me get this right. Your argument is that justice, the conception of justice, should be predicated upon a multiplicity of opinions as opposed to one standard, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's do a scenario here. If a slave trader thinks that it is just for him to own a slave because they believe the slave as subhuman, would his conception of justice be right simply because it is different than other people's? Or is his conception of justice wrong? And if so, how do you determine if it's wrong or not if you don't have a single standard of justice?
I was referring more to evaluating this round. So consequentially, you can
okay. Okay.
So deontological principles wise, there's a lot of wiggle room about what the right type of force is, whether or not we should.
How so?
Okay, so for example, if I'm gonna get robbed and I just to shoot my person who's robbing me, I think that's generally justified. But the question is there a limit to the sort of things I can do to the person who did something wrong?
Yeah, and under the deontological principle, you would have a clear criteria for that, whereas under a pluralistic view, it would depend on what mood the person is in on that day. So I'm not entirely sure that's consistent. You mentioned the Confederacy in the South not having a lot of political power. Can you tell me why you think the South seceded?
Because slavery. I also agree that the South is terrible.
Have you read the Cornerstone speech?
It is disgusting. I'm not saying that the South is right. I'm actually saying the opposite. I'm saying that this definition in question.
But they had a sense of justice. They had a certain idea of justice, right?
I guess you could say so.
And so what makes the North's idea of justice more consistent than the South's idea of justice? If we're all being pluralistic and it's up to individual whims, what makes it more consistent?
I think it's more grounded in individual rights.
Oh, so there is a standard then, but we have to have for justice.
It has to be measured consequentially, and you have to consider which individual rights. And sometimes different groups have different ideas about which individual rights are more important.
Are individual rights a consequential thing, or are they a deontological thing, or is it founded on deontological roots, or is there some consequentialist consequence, so to speak? Because you seem to be partitioning. Okay.
There's the John Stuart Mill interpretation.
Right.
Consequentialist. There's the David Friedman version, which is consequentialist. There's the Bastiat, which is generally consequentialist.
Right.
There's the virtue ethics thing. There's the Rawls difference principle. There's a lot of different approaches. That's my.
Right. And so just because there's a bunch of different approaches, does that mean those approaches are necessarily correct?
No.
Okay. Just checking. So one last question. So when you said force protects life, you mentioned, well, how do I necessarily determine when force is necessary for political revolutions, correct?
Yeah, and what sort of violence?
So okay. I'll take some of my prep time.
Okay, would you like running prep?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, I think I'm ready.
All right, you took 1 minute and 3 seconds of prep.
Alrighty, I'm ready. So again, I think my opponent for that very astute argument. I think that he makes a lot of interesting points that are very consequential to the resolution and understanding the real principles behind the resolution. But he started off his case by mentioning MLK, and I must say I find this happens a lot. A lot of folks are willing to mention MLK when they look at the sort of mass media commercialized variation of what he did, but they won't mention that about before he died, he was in Tennessee protesting with labor workers. He was getting increasingly agitated with how things are going, and he was sounding a lot like Malcolm X. I think that if we're going to mention historical figures, we should mention them in their holistic context and not just in a context that seems to benefit what we do. And so he essentially argues in this first part of the argument that revolution is bad because it does not take into account a pluralistic view of justice, which basically means, and if we're going into, basically means that since there are a lot of perspectives about justice, we have to consider all of them before we can have a simple standard. I don't think this is really a sound principle, primarily because if there is no set standard for justice, then there is no justice whatsoever. If everyone has their own interpretation and everyone's interpretation is taken into account, then you really cannot have a legal system. Consequentially, you cannot, under consequence sense, you cannot have any sort of standard for what good or bad is. You can simply have the views and the perceptions of people simply because they have views and perceptions. There are value standards that we have for ethical principles, or else they wouldn't really be consistent, or else they really wouldn't be ethical principles in the first place. So I think that this sort of value debate between if we weigh deontology or sort of consequentialism as the standard of value for ethical considerations should come down to this, judges. Do you want to have a single testable, semi-objective or objective criterion as to what good or bad is in a political system? Or do you want to have a viewpoint where you cannot have sort of any standard foundation for what good or bad is? If you have the latter, you can't really do any sort of, this debate doesn't really matter because we don't even have anything to weigh oppression or justice by. But if you have the former, you have a little bit more, I think, consistency in your decisions. And so he goes on to explain people who may feel like they're oppressed, like Christians who can't really say happy holidays anymore, or the Confederacy, and so on and so forth. And I think this kind of proves my point. If everyone has a sense of justice and everyone's sense of justice is equally valid, there is no justice. If the Confederate sense of justice, which the Confederate thought that at the Cornerstone speech, as I mentioned, that African Americans were subhumans, and the vice president of the Confederacy quite literally said the founders dropped the ball by not recognizing that Black people were subhumans. That was their sense of justice. But we understand that's wrong. But if we don't have the consistent sense of justice, how do we know it's wrong? Is it wrong because we feel like it's wrong? Okay, our feelings can change, can they not? This is not firm grounding to predicate decisions upon. And so he goes into the more pragmatic or practical ways as to why revolution is bad. And let me just say right here, I am not saying that revolution necessitates a better government, but I am saying, and the resolution only calls me to say, that yes, if my rights are being violated, I have a right to engage in violence. Now, violence does not have to be in a revolutionary format. Violence can simply be me going against a police officer who is trying to violate my rights. It can be much smaller scale. So I'm not necessarily mentioning revolutions here, and the resolution doesn't necessarily mention revolutions either. It simply mentions political oppression, which is an abstract term, and it also mentions violence propagated against people, the individual, me, which there is a deontological basis, for to I think go off of. And so there's nothing about revolutions that I'm defending, although I do think if there is a widespread oppression, revolutions may be justified, but that is entirely dependent on those circumstances. All the resolution calls us for is to evaluate political violence as a value against fighting oppression, and that can happen in many different forms, not necessarily one of our revolutions. And so his entire argument about revolutions, I'm not entirely making that argument. I'm simply saying, okay, thank you.
You can finish your thought, though.
Yeah, I'm simply saying that violence is a good value to be using against political oppression. Nothing about revolution. So after that, I see my sign.
Okay. Isadore, you have 2 minutes left of prep time.
And this is my last speech, right?
Correct.
Yeah. That's a 6-minute speech, right?
Correct.
Great, yeah. May I please have that time?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Is everyone ready? Great. So I want to explain why individual rights are actually a result of a pluralistic view of justice. So they're a result of a pluralistic view of justice because people have different goals and different determinations. So insofar as people are able to make their decisions, they do things that they find are just. My point is specifically surrounding how we view things. The word substantially is not really something that's able to be quantified. And a big reason why in my first cross-examination, I asked if he had a way of like weighing this sort of thing or explaining how to specifically and explicitly differentiate between good and bad is because as a result of the definition in question, he effectively ends up arguing for every revolution of every sort. And I think this is fundamental to this disagreement. So like one clear example of this is the communist revolutions. And a big reason why I bring this up is because feudalism is fundamentally dehumanizing. And this ended up leading to people overthrowing this because of the Red Guard and taking control. I'm going to suggest that there are multiple considerations when it comes to examining what justice is. Like if you sacrifice a little bit of individual rights and don't end up killing 100 million people, I'm inclined to think that's a good trade, which is why I think we have to inform justice with some degree of consequentialism. We have to look at how things play out in the real world. And as a result, I specifically want to show you why on balance, my side is winning the debate. So first I want to read the resolution again, specifically to make sure we're grounding this in the topic at hand and not in some abstract definition of what justice is. So the topic is on balance, in response to political oppression, violent revolution is justified, or something along those lines. And the reason why this is important though, is my opponent is arguing primarily for defensive force. So if someone's attacking you, he argues that you should be able to defend yourself. I don't disagree with this, but my point is more broadly about what it means to gain the resources necessary to have a violent revolution in the first place. And I'm looking specifically at the process of what happens when you take control of a country overall. And my arguments are primarily looking at individual rights too. And the claim that I've been making throughout is that the overall consequences of doing so are ultimately more degrading to the value of individual rights and human dignity than the alternative. I also provide two alternatives which better approach and better seek out justice in the first place. So let's go through why my side has a claim to winning this round. So number one, I point out that because of this resolution, side affirmative has to defend every violent revolution and look at it and determine whether or not there are more lives saved or more individual liberties gained from violent revolution than not, and compare that to an alternative, such as maybe like nonviolent protest or leaving and criticizing a regime. And specifically, that's where I think research has to come into place. We have to look at how this manifests itself in the world. And looking at the Omar Wassow card, which specifically looks at the issue of civil rights, it turns out that nonviolent protests actually had something like a 7.9% chance, or 7.9% bigger attitude shift than the contrary or violent attack. And the reason why this is important to this is if we're actually looking at what advances individual liberties, my argument is that a lot of times political violence does the exact opposite. If this is the case, and if we look at how our values are actually being upheld, there's a strong case to be made that political revolution isn't something that's going to be good. And I specifically want to talk about why this is important. So when we specifically look at the Chernowitz card, it said something like 52% of violent or of nonviolent protests were successful compared to 26% of violent revolutions. This is really important here. If we're looking at the likelihood of success of doing something, which I believe we should when we're actually talking about upholding dignity, it would seem that nonviolent is a better approach to this. Furthermore, if you look at the outcomes associated with violent revolution, it turns out that violent revolution is 3 times more likely to encounter mass killings, genocide, or politicide. And I provided a couple different reasons about why this is the case, such as nonviolent, or such as soldiers shooting back, such as oppressive states literally consolidating power and obliterating individual rights more. Fundamentally, when we're looking, like if we take my opponent's value criterion of individual rights and we're looking at which side does it better, I think there's a strong argument to be made that side negative provides better ways of change and allows people to rise up and escape oppression more thoroughly. And with that, I end my speech. And I thank you all for a great debate so far.
Excellent. And we will conclude with a 3-minute summary speech from affirmative. You have 1 minute and 57 seconds left of your prep time. Would you like to use any of it?
No, I'm all right. All right. Look, I want to thank everyone for participating in this debate. Isadore, the judges, once again, thank you guys so much. Ultimately, this debate comes down to this. Do you want to have a consistent standard for justice? And do you want to take into account how violence may or may not affect political oppression, principally, not necessarily entirely consequentially, but principally as a means to getting to the consequences? Or do you simply want to evaluate how consequences affect consequences and not how consequences affect principles? If you listen to my opponent, you'll be doing just that. And look, consequences are important. In fact, individual rights are predicated upon a deontological truth, which is, I think, protected consequentially. The law is a consequential force. I mean, the fact that force even exists is necessarily consequential, but it is predicated upon an objective criteria. This is the fundamental distinction here. The fundamental distinction is not if I am defending the communist revolution, which obviously, even by my criterion here, judges, I'm not. The fundamental distinction here is not if I'm not, like, do I have to defend every violent revolution, because I don't. The fundamental issue here is how oppression interacts with self-defense and how self-defense interacts with principles. And on that, as the criterion I have laid out for my debate, this value, that is why we're running this debate. And so, again, I encourage you to look at of course, look at the consequences, but look at what produces the consequences. Look at the backdrop behind the consequences. Not every revolution is made same. Not every action against political oppression is also made same. But there is a consistency in that when one's individual rights are aggressed, one's life is certainly aggressed. And when one fights against that, they're doing something quite virtuous. Yes, it's possible that those people could have different motivations. It's possible those people could have different life goals, and it's possible that all individuals, in fact, it's certain that all individuals are different and are vastly differentiated, but that does not say anything as to the consistency of the principle of their rights. Individuals are different, but the principle of their rights is something that remains not stagnant, but remains the same and consistent, because if it didn't, their rights wouldn't matter in the first place. And so this is not a debate about consequences. This is primarily a debate about how consequences are produced, the foundation of which, and that is why I urge you on that basis to vote for affirmative. Thank you.
Wow, you're an incredible speaker, Christian.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, that concludes the championship round of this debate tournament. So thank you so much to both of our debaters and to all of our judges. At this point, I and the judges will mute our Zoom calls and briefly enter into a separate room where the judges will discuss and talk about their ballots. At this time, we'll also go ahead and display the post-debate poll, and we will join back with you in a few minutes. Thank you so much for your patience. So now all the judges have made their decisions, and it also looks like the people have voted, but let's see how the judges voted. So each judge will announce their ballot and then give a few minutes of feedback to each of the debaters. So let's start with Professor Barnett.
He
Actually, I
said he'd
think
be back in a few minutes.
okay, yeah, he said he needs to be back. Okay, we can start with Dr. Palmer.
I thought that both did really an admirable job, and I was impressed by that. I do think that there was some confusion, which Christian picked up very quickly on, about the value pluralism or different theories of morality. On the one hand, there's theoretical frameworks for moral decisions, deontology, virtue ethics, consequentialism, etc. And on the other hand, there's substantive views about what's right and wrong. And you went back and forth between them, and I think that Christian picked up on that and honed in on the implication of value pluralism. And I thought drilled down on that very effectively. On the other hand, I think that Christian was not as responsive to the debate topic and defended self-defense rather than violent revolution. And at the end, Isadore brought that home, I think, very powerfully, that it wasn't responsive to the debate topic as such. Self-defense is one thing, violent revolution is another. So I think that balancing two very, very good jobs, I would have to say, I think that the balance of the arguments in terms of what was responded to and what not would go to Isadore.
All right, thank you, Dr. Palmer. Dr. Brennan, what are your thoughts?
Great. Well, thanks to both of you. It's really impressive. You're able to cover a wide range of ground at a very sophisticated way in a short period of time. So we can all take a lesson from you in doing that. So there were things I liked about both of you, things I thought both of you could have done better. And I think, let's start with Isadore. You know, as Tom pointed out, you've confused the question of disagreements of what value is with the question of high-level abstract moral theorizing, with the question of value pluralism, which can mean like there's lots of different standards of justice. You know, morality is more than one thing versus you and I disagree about what morality is. And I think Christian just during his response crushed you on that because he got you pushed into saying some very uncomfortable things. And you also gave some very unsympathetic examples. I think what you were trying to say was, as Tom put it when we were talking about this in deliberation, people who don't want the revolution get swept up and bear the consequences, and they didn't consent to that revolution anymore than the people who are being oppressed consented to the oppressive government, and that's a problem. I think for both of you, I would say, you have an impressive knowledge of background political philosophy and theory, but in the short period of time you're given, you can't really explain that stuff. It's very contentious. People, you know, who believes in deontology, who believes in consequentialism? I'm a professional political philosopher. I don't know which of those theories is right. And you can't convince if you start with a controversial premise, it becomes extremely difficult to argue for your conclusion. So if you think about like Peter Singer, who I think is an excellent philosopher when it comes to arguing for substantive points, he just goes, hey, you, the reader, you agree with this, you agree with this, you agree with this. It doesn't matter what the high level moral theory is. You agree with these premises. They lead to this surprising conclusion. And I think you're both on much more solid ground when you stuck with that. At the end of the day, though, I think there was some confusion about what exactly was the proposition that you were defending. It was about revolution. I think, Christian, at the end, at first it seemed like you were defending more violent resistance to injustice. And then towards the end, you switched over and you said, like, look, it is about revolution. I don't have to defend all wars to show that war is in principle justifiable. So like the statistical analysis of when war works and when it doesn't is not as important to me. I think that was a good response, but I think you got caught up on the other things. At the end, it was really hard, but I have to go with Isadore as I think the winner. Because I think there were just more substantive points that were not addressed, and you stuck closer to what we thought the resolution was.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Brennan. And finally, we have Professor Barnett.
I'm unmuted, I hope. You can hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. So anyway, congratulations to both of you for just a tremendous job. I enjoyed very much listening to both of you. Had a bit of a hard time keeping up with both of you because you had so much substance in your presentations. I was a bit surprised at the outcome that I came to because I thought that in many respects, Christian is the stronger debater, both in his presentation style, in his clarity, in his organization. So I certainly thought, as I was going through the debate, that it looked like he was on the trajectory to win the debate. But under the rules, I felt constrained to evaluate this according to the substance of the debate. And I thought that it was a bad decision to not move on from self-defense to revolution. That by itself would not have been a fatal mistake, except that Isadore caught it and exposed it. So kudos to Isadore for being able to find a chink in the armor, which is very substantial. Christian, you've got great armor. And finding the chink in the armor, actually pointing it out in, I thought, a pretty clear way, to the point where at this point I became unclear about what the resolution was, because I thought the resolution was about revolution, but now there's two different propositions on the table: self-defense versus revolution. Which was it? I actually asked in the judges' room for someone to clarify for me what the resolution was, because that was going to determine the outcome for me. So that was the second point. The first point was the first mistake, I think, was to shade the debate in the direction of self-defense rather than revolution. Secondly, Isadore was able to find this mistake, pointed out in a clear way. And then the final piece was, I did not think that Christian adequately responded to that challenge. That is, I think at that point, the debate was still salvageable. Had there been a concerted effort to respond, I agree with Jason, there was some response. But I didn't think that was adequate to take into account the considerations that Isadore successfully raised about the problems associated, for the point of view of justice and rights, with violent revolution, as opposed to the use of force or coercion in order to resist oppression in an individualistic basis. So at the end of the day, I was actually surprised at the outcome that I came to, which is that Isadore had won the debate on substance, even though I would have probably given Christian the debate on style.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to all of our judges. Based on the judges' decision, we officially announced Isadore Johnson as the winner of this debate tournament. So congratulations, Isadore. As the winner, he will be receiving $500 from SFL.
Oh.
And let's also give congratulations to our runner-up, Christian Watson, who was also
good job, bro.
a winner, and will be receiving $200 from SFL.
Bravo.
Awesome.
Let me
Thank you, guys.
can I add to this? If Christian and Isadore would email me their mailing addresses, I will have sent to them a copy of my book, The Structure of Liberty, Justice, and the Rule of Law, which discusses natural rights and basically disclaims the deontological consequentialist approach. So in other words, I don't believe either approach is correct. And it might be useful for both of you to be exposed to another defense of natural rights that is neither specifically consequentialist nor deontological. And I'm happy to have that book sent to you if I get your mailing address. My email address is rbarnett@gmail.com, rbarnett@gmail.com.
Thank you, Professor Barnett. And thank you everyone for joining us. This was a lot of work to put on, and we're all extremely happy and grateful for the results. Thank you especially to our esteemed judges for taking the time to debate this round. I have to say, I am a huge fan of each of you, so even to just be in your presence here is very, very exciting.
And you're not even in our presence.
Or even the virtual presence, Professor, is so astonishing for me. And of course, thank you so much for our participants throughout the tournament, not just the finalists, for putting in all the work it took to prepare for this debate. And of course, thank you to our audience members for watching. We hope to have future debate tournaments, and we hope to see you all there. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your evening, everyone.
Before you guys go, can I ask one question? I know that Kristen and I both have radio shows. in the future, would it be improprietous to invite any of you to speak about your political philosophies and or related topic areas?
I'd be delighted. It would be completely proprietous.
The proprietousness of it is inexpressible. Sure.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. Thanks for asking.
All right. Take care, everyone. Great job.
Great job.
Yeah, goodbye.